Prosecutor, you may call your first witness.
I call the County Sheriff Art Miranda to stand. What is your report of Carl Hines' death?
Well, Deputy Martinson, I received a report that Carl Haynes' fishing boat had been seen drifting in Bright Sand Bay.
Let's go check it out.
We need to find out what happened to Carl. Let's check out his boat. We can take a boat out there to investigate. The lights are still on, and the battery is the wrong kind.
That's strange. And the net is still out?
Let's reel the net in.
Carl banged his head.
I would like to call my second witness, Horace Whaley, to the stand.
Is that what killed him?
I found there was a wound on his head. Someone may have hit him, or maybe he took a fall and was drowned. As you can see, Art, the foam coming out of his mouth shows that he was breathing when he went into the water. With the head wound as an obvious factor, he could have been setting his net and got careless.
That bang to the head is sort of funny, you know.
I remember saying to Art that he ought to look for a Jap with a bloody gun butt, a right-handed Jap.
Horace,
Good morning.
you testified to having applied pressure to the deceased's chest, and a peculiar foam appeared around his mouth and nostrils.
That's right.
What causes this?
It's a result of a chemical reaction in the lungs caused by breathing.
Now, this is where I'm confused. You say this foam is only produced if a person is breathing, correct?
This can happen while you're drowning because as you struggle, you try to breathe, swallowing water and exerting out air, creating the foam.
It tells you that he wasn't murdered first. If he was, there would be no foam, would there?
It tells you that.
So, your conclusion is that he drowned.
Of course, there's doubt.
Beyond doubt that he was alive at the time of submersion.
Yes.
Beyond doubt. Thank you, Horace. There's something else I would like to ask about the autopsy report. On page 2, paragraph 2, if you could read the first line for us, please.
A secondary and minor laceration of the right hand is noted.
Any idea how it got there?
It probably occurred between the 1st through the 4th hour.
I need to ask about the deceased head you mentioned. Can you tell us how it looked?
About 2.5 inches long, just slightly above the left ear. It's evident from an injury, something narrow, something flat had caused this injury.
Is that what you saw, or is that an inference?
I infer from the diseased wound that something narrow and flat caused his injury. It's the same as if you fall off your motorcycle at 40 miles per hour on a paved highway. The gravel will leave behind pattern abrasions that don't look like anything else but an imprint.
You're saying that if the victim is propelled against an object, his own forward motion might produce the observed injury.
It's possible.
Thank you, Horace. I have no further questions.
Abel, may I have permission to speak to my husband, Kaboo? You'll have to do it from over there. He can turn and face you, but that's about it. You can make it through this, Kaboo. Your family is relying on that. I remember when I was 10 years old. I used to play on the South Beach with a boy named Ishmael Chambers. One day he had kissed me. However, when Kaboo asked if I had kissed anyone before I met him, I answered never. Another memory that crossed my mind was Kaboo and my wedding night. We shared a romantic night at our family's house. The only thing between us and the rest of the family was a thin sheet and a loud radio. Finally, I remember the day Kaboo told me he was leaving in 8 days for Camp Shelby, Mississippi. There he would join the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. He told me he had to go to war.
I remember watching this Japanese girl dig up geoducks. We would gather around the shy clams and discuss their appearances. When we were 14 years old, geoducks were important. It was summer, and little else mattered. We sat and stared at the ocean, debating on whether or not the oceans went on forever, or if they just stopped. One of my best memories I could have had with her was the first time I told her I liked her. With my eyes closed, I looked at her and said, "I've always liked you, Hatsue." My heart was pumping. I did the only thing I could think of doing. I pushed my lips against hers. Miss Hine, as I have looked over, it has seemed that Kabuo Miyamoto showed up at your apartment in July of 1945. Is that correct?
Yes, he did. Unexpected, of course.
What did the defendant indicate was the nature of his business with you?
He wanted to talk about land.
What exactly did he say?
I hadn't seen him since the day the Japs left. He came up to the door and said, "I guess Carl isn't home." I told him that Carl Sr. had passed on. Kabuo gave me his grief and continued on saying he had an agreement with Mr. Hine. I had told him once again that Carl Sr. had passed away and I was obligated to sell the farm. Finally, he told me what I did was wrong, and then I commanded him to get out of my house.
Did you see the defendant afterwards?
I saw him in town. He always gave me dirty looks, but never approached me.
To your knowledge, were the two of them, your son and Kabuo, on friendly terms?
The defendant was no friend of my son, more like an enemy.
Enemy?
Carl told me once he'd wish Kabuo would forget about the 7 acres. He said he would keep a close eye out for Kabuo.
Thank you. Once again, Miss Hines.
I've done some calculating, and the Miyamoto family purchased the 7 acres for $4,500, correct?
Never finished their payments.
Thank you, Etta. That'll be all. Sheriff Morin, I have in my hand 4 pieces of rope. May I ask you to inspect them, please?
Okay.
Do you recognize them?
I do.
Do you refer to these pieces of mooring line in your report?
These are them. A came from the defendant's boat. It matches all of his other sterning lines except from the second cleat from the stern. B was new, brand new to be exact.
Where did you find the other 2, Sheriff?
I found them on Carl Haynes' boat. C is exactly the same as every other line. The last one doesn't match up with the rest, although it does match the ones found on the defendant's boat.
But yet, you found it on the deceased's boat.
That's right.
Sheriff, if the defendant had tied up to Carl Hines' boat, would these 2 cleats in question line up?
You bet they'd line up.
Thank you. I have no more questions.
Hello, Hatsue. May I give you a ride home?
Please. Your newspaper.
I'm listening.
Kabuo's trial is unfair. You should write about it in your newspaper.
What's unfair? I'd be happy to write about it if you tell me.
All of it. Kabuo would never kill anyone. That trial is unnecessary.
I know it's unfair, but I stop and wonder if unfairness is just a part of the world.
I'm not talking about the whole world. I'm talking about people in general.
You're right. People shouldn't have to be unfair. Are you a radio man?
I am now. Last month, a couple of guys got transferred and I got moved up.
Looks like I'm going to be a while. Might as well go on to your own business. I'm done. But is Philip Milholland around?
Milholland is gone and then we moved up.
When did Milholland leave?
September 16th on a night shift. He couldn't have left on the 15th because he was working the night of the 15th, so it had to be the 16th.
I know that on the night Carl Hayne had drowned, stopped his watch at 1:47. A freighter plowed through ship channel bank at 1:42, throwing before it a wall of water big enough to throw the small gill netter boat overboard.
That murder trial. I suppose you've been busy with that.
It's all I think about.
I have to think it's travesty. I believe they had arrested him for his race. What do you think?
I've covered every minute. All evidence pointing to him is very solid.
How so?
Miss Miyamoto, on Tuesday, September 7th, your husband inquired the purchase of the 7 acres.
He did.
I see. Now, was this on the evening of September 7th that your husband told you about this?
We talked about it in the late afternoon.
Late afternoon. Did your husband seem disappointed?
No, he was not disappointed. He was hopeful.
Okay then. Let us now skip forward to September 8th. Did he talk about the land at all? Was he still hopeful?
He was very hopeful. He decided to go and have a talk with Carl Hine about the 7 acres.
But he didn't go.
Yes, he wanted to plan out all that he was going to say to Mr. Hine.
So, on the afternoon of September 9th, in the aftermath with his talk with Carl Hine, did your husband still seem hopeful?
More hopeful than ever. He told me that he felt like he was closer than ever to getting to his family's land back. I felt hopeful by that point, hopeful that it would all work out.
Carl's mother had said that the two men had not been on best of terms. What made you so hopeful?
I was hopeful because Carl and his mother are two different people.
Okay, now, on the following Thursday, September 16th, Carl Hine was found dead in a fishing net at White Sand Bay. Do you know if during this week your husband had talked to Mr. Hine about the 7 acres?
Kaboo felt like there was nothing to do, that the next move was Carl Hine's, that it was Carl's turn to move forward.
Thank you, Miss Miyamoto.
Miss Miyamoto, your husband told you a story about having to stop and help Carl Hine change the battery out at sea. Is this correct?
Correct.
He said he tied up to Carl's boat to loan him a battery, correct?
Correct.
And as he did this, he and Carl discussed the 7 acres, correct?
That is what happened.
Do you happen to repeat this story to anyone, and that you would get the farm?
I did not.
Why not?
Well, we have heard that Carl had passed away just a few hours after we found out the great news, so we figured everything was just up in the air again.
Everything was up in the air. When you heard Carl had died, you decided not to talk about the matter?
You are misinterpreting.
I'm not misinterpreting. I just want to know the facts.
There is nothing to talk about. What news could I announce? Everything was up in the air. Silence seemed better.
Well, that was a mistake. The irony was that the mistake was that not coming forward.
But there was no time to come forward.
No more questions, Your Honor.
That will be all, Mrs. Miyamoto. Mr. Gillanders, in your 30 years of working, have you ever had the occasion in which you had to board another man's ship?
About 6 or 7 times in my whole 30 years.
Can you recall what occasion?
Always some fellow who was broke down or somebody who had engine problems.
So, you boarded if fellow needs a hand, and no other reasons than that.
It's the unwritten rule of the sea. You don't board other people's boat without a reason. You fish and you let them fish.
So, you don't suppose that my defendant here could have boarded Carl Hine's boat without a reason?
I've never heard of boarding someone else's boat, but for any other reason.
Suppose you wanted to kill a man.
You couldn't board another man's boat unless he wanted to. Carl Hines in particular. He's such a big man and Kaboo's so little. He doesn't even have enough force. It just isn't possible.
It isn't possible.
Kaboo didn't board Carl's boat without Carl's will. Tying is too tricky.
All right. Thank you. That is all.
Were you about to come forward with your battery story before your arrest?
I thought about it.
Nor did you tell it after your arrest when you had an attorney? So I ask you, what is the truth?
I told you the truth.
I see. On the morning of September 16th, you returned from a night's fishing and told your wife about your conversation with Carl. Is that right?
It is.
What next?
I went to sleep. Until 1:30, my wife woke me up to tell me about Carl's death.
Well, I can't think of any more questions, so the witness is free to step down. Kaboo Miyamoto was driven by hatred and cold desperation that after so many years of comforting his lost strawberry fields, he has found himself in a position to lose them for good in September. He had tried to go to Carl Hine and talk about getting the farms back, but Carl turned away. So this strong, unfeeling man decided to solve his problem by taking the life of another man. Thank you. I hope that the jury will take all of this information and make the right decision.
Perhaps there is such a thing as fate. An accident of some kind has befallen Carl Hine in a moment that could not be less fortunate for Kabuo. I hope that although fate is against him, human beings will be reasonable. This case now draws to a close.
You knew about the freighter?
I sat on it for a day. I didn't know what else I should do.
I understand. Mr. Chambers discovered these. He brought them to me last night.
And a freighter came out there the night Carl died. A freighter came through the ship channel bank, just like I said. If you are capable of reading shorthand, take these notes. You know when you were testifying, Art, you mentioned a coffee cup. Yes. And it was in the middle of the floor and nothing else. Abel just cleaned it up. A cup on the floor. Doesn't that suggest the boat got waked? There is no other evidence, but just above the crossbar, the cut lashings. Where a lantern was hung? I never took it down a lantern. What are you talking about?